Before we get started, please like and subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from, and you can support the channel by clicking thanks or joining. I never believed the forest could speak. I grew up in a quiet town in northern Oregon, where the trees stood tall and silent, like old guards watching over forgotten land. People came here to hike, to camp, to escape the noise of the city. I came back because I had nowhere else to go. After my divorce and the collapse of my journalism career, I returned to my childhood home with a single suitcase and a mind full of questions I could not outrun. What I did not expect was that the forest I once loved would remember me better than I remembered myself. The first whisper came on my third night back. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scrape against the window, when I heard my name spoken clearly, softly, as if someone stood just outside the house. I sat up, holding my breath. The voice was not loud or threatening. It sounded patient, certain. I told myself it was stress or exhaustion or the echo of a memory. Still, I did not sleep again that night. The next morning, I walked toward the tree line behind my house. The forest began less than 50 yards from my back door. A dense wall of evergreens, tangled roots, and shadows. As a child, I used to play there for hours, building forts and pretending the woods were alive. Standing there now, I felt a pressure in my chest, like the forest was watching me think. I laughed quietly at myself and turned back before the unease could grow. That afternoon, I found an old notebook while unpacking boxes in the attic. It was one of mine from high school, filled with half-finished stories and notes about strange sounds I used to hear at night. One page made my hands go cold. I had written about whispers in the forest. I described hearing my own future spoken in fragments, dates, names, moments I had not yet lived. I did not remember writing any of it. That night, the whispers returned louder, closer. I heard them through the walls, through the floor, vibrating inside my skull. They spoke in overlapping voices, never shouting, never rushing. They said, "Tomorrow you will find blood on your hands." I backed away from the window, heart racing. I checked the locks, checked every room until dawn came. Nothing happened the next day. No blood, no accident. Relief washed over me, and with it a dangerous thought. What if the forest was wrong? The following evening, my phone rang just before sunset. It was my younger brother, Mark. We had not spoken in months. He told me he was driving up to visit, that he needed to talk. My stomach tightened. The whispers had not mentioned him, but they began again as soon as the call ended. They said he will not leave. They said you will blame yourself. I tried to call him back, but the signal dropped as the sky darkened. I went into the forest with a flashlight and my phone clenched in my hand. The air grew colder with every step. The trees seemed closer than before, their branches woven together like fingers. The whispers surrounded me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. They spoke calmly, describing moments I had not yet seen. They described Mark stepping out of his car at the edge of the road. They described the sound of metal folding, the smell of fuel, the silence afterward. I screamed for them to stop, but the forest did not respond to fear. It responded to listening. The whispers softened, as if encouraging me to understand. They said the forest does not predict the future. It remembers all possible futures. It chooses which one survives. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over a root slick with moisture. I ran until my lungs burned, and the house lights came into view. Mark never arrived that night. The police found his car wrapped around a tree less than a mile from my house. They said it was an accident caused by fatigue. I nodded and signed papers and answered questions. I did not tell them about the whispers. At his funeral, I stood among strangers, feeling the forest hum in the distance. The whispers had been right. After that, I stopped fighting them. I returned to the forest every night just before midnight. I listened as they spoke of small things at first. A broken mug, a missed phone call, rain arriving early. Each time they were correct. The forest rewarded attention with certainty, and certainty was addictive. One night the whispers changed. They spoke of me in ways they never had before. They said you will walk deeper tomorrow. They said you will ask the wrong question. They said the forest will answer honestly. I realized then that knowing the future did not make me safer. It made me complicit. The forest was not warning me. It was preparing me. I am writing this now because the whispers have begun again. They say you are listening. They say you want to know what happens next. They say the forest already knows when you will come looking for it. And once it learns your name, it never forgets. After my brother died, the forest did not grow silent. It grew attentive. Every night I felt its presence pressing against the walls of my house like a patient listener waiting for me to speak first. I tried to return to something resembling a normal life. I cooked meals I barely tasted. I answered emails from editors who no longer wanted my work. I told myself grief was distorting my senses, but grief does not whisper directions. The whispers returned the night after the funeral. They came earlier than usual, before the moon had fully risen. They spoke with clarity, no longer testing my fear. They said tomorrow you will receive an envelope that should not exist. They said do not open it inside the house. I stood in the doorway, staring into the dark trees, feeling a familiar pull deep in my chest. The forest was no longer calling, it was instructing. The envelope arrived just after noon. No return address, no stamp, no sign of how it reached my mailbox. My name was written in careful handwriting that matched the notebook from the attic. My hands trembled as I carried it outside and sat on the back steps facing the trees. The whispers grew louder, urging patience, urging obedience. When I opened the envelope, I found a single sheet of paper. On it was a list of events dated weeks into the future. At the bottom was my signature. The first item on the list came true within hours. A local power outage plunged the town into darkness. The second followed the next day when a man collapsed in the grocery store aisle. I watched paramedics carry him out, knowing before they said it that he would not survive. The forest did not celebrate. It observed. I returned to the woods that night, unable to resist. I asked the question the whispers had been waiting for. Why me? The forest answered by showing me memories that were not mine. I saw children wandering too far from home, adults listening too closely, lovers seeking answers they were not meant to hear. The forest did not choose me. I chose it years ago when I first listened. The whispers told me there were others like me once, listeners who learned too much too quickly. Some disappeared, some stayed and became part of the forest itself. I felt a sharp terror then, not of dying but of remaining. I asked if Mark could have been saved. The forest paused longer than ever before. Then it said, "You already know the answer." Sleep became impossible. When I closed my eyes, I saw branching paths, endless variations of my life, splitting and rejoining. Each night, the whispers narrowed the choices. They warned me away from certain actions, nudged me toward others. I stopped arguing. Resistance only brought pain. One evening, they told me to follow a narrow trail I had never seen before. It opened behind a stand of trees I thought I knew well. The path descended sharply into darkness, where the air smelled of damp earth and old leaves. I felt like I was walking backward through time. At the bottom, I found a clearing with stones arranged in a circle. In the center lay bones, human bones, bleached and orderly. The whispers said these are the listeners who stayed too long. They said the forest does not kill, it keeps. I backed away, nausea rising. But the path behind me was gone, replaced by solid trees. Panic surged, and for the first time the whispers hardened. They said calm is survival. I forced myself to breathe, and after a long moment, the trees parted, allowing me to leave. When I returned home, the envelope list had grown longer. New pages appeared on my kitchen table, written in the same careful hand. Events became more personal. Conversations, word-for-word choices I had not yet made. At the end of the final page was a question written in darker ink. Will you help us remember? I understood then the forest was not a prophet. It was an archive. It collected lives, futures, outcomes, preserving them through those who listen. By hearing the whispers, I was becoming a vessel carrying possibilities forward. I wanted to stop, but I no longer knew how. Tonight, the whispers are urgent. They say someone else is listening now. They say you are closer than you think. They say the forest is hungry for new memories, and it has already made space for you. By the third week, I no longer measured time in days. I measured it in predictions fulfilled. The forest spoke, and the world obeyed. That was how it felt, at least. I woke each morning with a sense of dread sharpened by certainty, knowing that whatever the whispers described would unfold whether I acted or not. Knowing the future did not grant power, it removed choice. The town began to notice changes in me. Neighbors waved, and I forgot their names. Conversations slipped past as background noise, while my attention drifted toward the tree line. Even in daylight, the forest seemed darker than it should be. The leaves barely moved when the wind blew through town, as if the trees were conserving energy for something more important. One afternoon, I received an email from a former editor asking if I could meet for coffee. He said he wanted to discuss a new project. The whispers stirred immediately. They said you will accept. They said this meeting will not be about work. They said someone will follow you home. I nearly deleted the message. Then I remembered the list, the envelopes, the bones in the clearing. Refusing never stopped anything. It only delayed understanding. The cafe was busy and loud. For a moment I felt almost normal, listening to the hiss of the espresso machine and the murmur of voices. My editor talked about a story he wanted me to investigate. A series of disappearances near protected land, missing hikers, missing hunters, missing locals. My hands went cold. He did not mention the forest by name, but he did not need to. I could hear it already whispering approval. When I left the cafe, I felt eyes on me, not the abstract gaze of the forest, but something closer, heavier. I walked faster, cutting through side streets toward my house. The whispers did not warn me away. They urged patience. They said, let him see where you go. I did not turn around until I reached my driveway. A man stood across the street pretending to check his phone. When our eyes met, he smiled too quickly. That night, the whispers explained him. They said he is another listener. They said he has been listening longer than you. They said he wants what you have. I asked what that meant. And for once, the forest answered with a feeling instead of words. A deep territorial hunger. Sleep abandoned me completely. When I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing again, but this time the bones were arranged differently. The skulls faced outward, as if watching for intruders. I woke with the taste of soil in my mouth and scratches on my arms I could not explain. The next envelope arrived before dawn. This one was thicker, heavier. Inside were photographs of me taken over the past few days, walking through town, sitting on my porch, standing at the forest edge at night. The final photo showed me sleeping in my bed. Written on the back was a single sentence: the forest shares what it keeps. Fear finally broke through the numbness. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly until the whispers guided me back toward the woods. They said you cannot outrun memory. They said you must choose your place. At the edge of the forest, I saw him again, the man from the cafe. He stepped from behind a tree, smiling calmly. He told me his name was Daniel. He said he had been listening since childhood, just like me. He said the forest showed him futures where I replaced him, futures where there was no room for both of us. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. They did not contradict him. Daniel said the forest requires balance. One listener must eventually remain. The other must be released. I asked what released meant. He glanced toward the deeper woods where the trail descended into darkness. He did not answer. I backed away, but the trees shifted, blocking my path. Panic surged. But the whispers steadied me. They said you already know how this ends. They showed me two futures side by side in one. Daniel lay among the bones, the forest quiet, satisfied. In the other I did. The difference was small. A single choice, a single step. I screamed that I would not choose. The forest responded with silence, colder than any whisper. In that silence, I understood the truth. The forest did not care who stayed. It cared that someone did. I took a step forward and felt the ground soften beneath my feet. The last thing I heard before darkness closed in was Daniel whispering my name, not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once. The forest had already decided who I was becoming. I did not disappear that night, but something else did. When I woke the next morning, the sense of who I had been felt thinner, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Daniel was gone. There were no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone else had stood with me at the edge of the forest. Only the whispers remained steady and calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. They told me to go home. They told me the forest was satisfied for now. I obeyed without thinking because obedience had become easier than fear. Inside my house, I found the photographs gone and the envelopes missing. In their place lay my old notebook open on the kitchen table. New pages had been filled overnight. The handwriting was still mine, but the words felt older than me. The notes described events from decades ago: fires, floods, disappearances, accidents blamed on weather or chance. Each ended with the same sentence written in different ink: "The forest remembered." I realized then that the whispers were not new. They had spoken through others long before me, shaping small choices, nudging lives toward outcomes that fed something vast and patient. The town changed after that. People avoided the woods more than usual. Trails closed without explanation. A hiker vanished, and no search was organized. It was as if everyone sensed that looking too closely would cost more than ignorance. I felt separate from them, carrying knowledge that made casual conversation unbearable. One evening, my editor called again. His voice sounded strained. He said the man following me had vanished. "Daniel?" I asked how he knew the name, and the line went quiet. He said it was in his notes from years ago, attached to a story he never finished. A story about a forest that traded futures. He asked if I was involved. The whispers told me to lie, so I did. That night, the forest spoke differently, not in predictions, but in invitations. They showed me a place deeper inside where the trees grew crooked and the ground dipped into a hollow. They said, "You will understand more there." I resisted for hours, pacing my house, until the pressure became unbearable. At midnight, I stepped into the woods. The path was clearer now, as if waiting for me. The deeper I went, the warmer the air became, thick with the smell of sap and decay. In the hollow, I found carvings cut into the trunks of ancient trees. Names, dates, symbols that repeated in patterns I almost recognized. Listener marks, proof that others had stood here trying to leave something behind. The whispers told me to add my name. I refused. They did not argue. Instead, they showed me what happened to those who did not leave a mark. I saw futures where they wandered forever, unable to hear or be heard, dissolving into noise. Terror clenched my chest. I carved my name. The forest responded with a low vibration through the ground. Images flooded my mind faster than I could process. I saw Daniel again, but not as I remembered him. He stood rooted to the earth, his body fused with bark, eyes open and calm. Not dead, preserved, listening eternally. I stumbled back, retching. The whispers softened, offering comfort. They said he chose his place, You will choose yours too. I asked how many listeners remained. The forest answered only as many as it needs. When I returned home, something was waiting on my porch. A small wooden box. Inside lay a key, old iron, heavy with age. Attached was a tag written in my handwriting. When you are ready. The whispers said nothing about it, which frightened me more than any prediction. Sleep came in fragments. Each dream placed me somewhere else inside the forest, watching myself from a distance, making decisions I had not yet made. I woke knowing what would happen before I lived it. The boundary between now and later dissolved. In the morning, I found fresh dirt under my fingernails and leaves in my hair. The key was warm in my pocket, though I did not remember taking it. The whispers returned to their usual tone and delivered a simple message. Tonight, you will unlock something that has been closed for a long time. I am afraid not of what I will find, but of how easily I will accept it. The forest has stopped asking. It assumes my answer. On with every whisper, it sounds more like my own voice. The key felt heavier each hour I carried it, not because of its weight, but because of what it promised. The whispers did not rush me. They never did. They waited with the confidence of something that understood time better than I ever could. All day I felt the forest leaning closer, stretching its attention through roots and soil until even the walls of my house felt temporary. I tried to distract myself with routine. I washed dishes I did not use. I reread old articles I once felt proud of. Every sentence felt written by someone else. The man who had chased stories across the country had not known what listening truly meant. That man was gone now, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. As evening fell, the whispers began to gather. They did not speak at once. They layered themselves slowly like fog rolling into a valley. Tonight, they said, you will see where it begins. Tonight, you will learn what the key protects. I wanted to throw it into the woods and run, but the thought barely formed before the forest pressed back with calm certainty. It said you already belong to what waits. The door revealed itself only when darkness settled fully. It stood between two trees I had passed hundreds of times without noticing. Old wood reinforced with iron bands half swallowed by bark and moss. No handle, only a keyhole black and deep. The air around it felt warmer like a held breath. My hands shook as I raised the key. When the lock turned, the sound echoed far beyond the door, not outward but inward, as if something inside me had opened as well. The door creaked slowly, revealing a narrow passage sloping down into darkness. The whispers urged me forward, but did not follow. For the first time, I felt truly alone. The passage ended in a chamber carved directly from earth and stone. Roots threaded through the ceiling, pulsing faintly like veins. In the center stood a long table covered in objects, journals, photographs, fragments of clothing, watches, rings, lives reduced to artifacts. Along the walls, names were carved layered over one another until they became unreadable. I understood without being told. This was where listeners left pieces of themselves, proof of attention paid. The forest did not just remember futures, it remembered people. I picked up a journal and recognized the handwriting from my notebook. though the dates were decades old. Each entry ended the same way. I am still listening. The whispers returned softly, filling the chamber. They explained the bargain at last. To listen was to be spared from uncertainty, to be guided away from chaos. In return, the forest claimed moments, memories, identities. It needed witnesses to preserve what might otherwise vanish. Without listeners, the futures would collapse into noise. I asked what happened when a listener gave too much. The forest showed me visions of hollow figures wandering the woods, unable to remember their names. Empty vessels, still hearing, still obeying. Terror surged through me. I asked how to leave. The whispers did not answer. Instead, they showed me another vision, a future where the town burned, where the forest was cut down, where nothing remained to remember anything at all. They showed me myself, walking away, key discarded, knowledge lost. The emptiness of that future felt worse than death. I sank to my knees, clutching the journal. The forest did not force my choice. It never had. It only made the alternatives unbearable. I left something on the table. Then my wedding ring, worn thin from years of habit. The moment it touched the wood, a sharp clarity filled my mind. Paths aligned, doubt quieted. When I stepped back into the forest, the door was already gone. The key lay cold in my hand, cracked down the center, useless. The whispers spoke approval, not joy, but balance restored. I walked home knowing something essential had been taken and something else had been given in its place. That night, I dreamed of the forest stretching endlessly across the world, its roots touching every forgotten place. I woke with dirt on my feet and a sense of purpose I did not recognize. The whispers greeted me like an old friend. They said tomorrow someone will knock on your door asking for answers. They said you will know what to say. And they said the forest will be listening through you now. The knock came exactly as the whispers promised. 3 measured taps at my front door just after sunset. Not urgent, not hesitant, certain. I stood in the hallway, listening to my own breath, and felt the forest settle into a familiar, attentive silence. This moment had already happened somewhere else. I was only catching up to it now. When I opened the door, a woman stood on the porch, clutching a folded map. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that sleep never fixes. Her name was Sarah. She said she had been hiking alone when she heard voices calling her deeper into the woods. She said the voices knew things about her childhood, things she had never spoken aloud. She found my address written in the dirt near the trailhead. I did not ask how she knew my name. I already felt the answer moving through me like a second heartbeat. I invited her inside and made tea we did not drink. As she spoke, I felt the whispers coil tighter around my thoughts, guiding my words, shaping my expressions. I was not repeating them. I was translating. Sarah asked if the forest was dangerous. I told her the truth carefully. It was not dangerous in the way people expect. It did not attack. It listened. It remembered. That was worse. Her hands shook as she unfolded the map. I recognized the markings immediately. Listener paths. She had walked farther than most, The whispers urged patience. They said, "Let her speak." She told me she had lost her father years ago in a hiking accident. Never found, never explained. Recently, she began dreaming of trees bending toward her, whispering apologies. She believed the forest had taken him. She wanted him back. I felt a sharp echo of my own grief surface, then quiet. I told her the forest did not take people. It kept them. The difference mattered more than she knew. Her face crumpled as understanding dawned. She asked if she could speak to him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, urgent. They said, "Do not promise what you cannot give." They said, "Show her where listening leads." I stood and walked toward the back door. Sarah followed without hesitation. Outside, the forest waited, calm and welcoming. The trees leaned subtly, opening a narrow path I had never seen before. We walked in silence until the sounds of town vanished completely. The air thickened, warm and damp. I felt the forest through my feet, through my spine. I was no longer a guest. I was infrastructure. Sarah stopped when she heard the whisper say her name. Tears streamed down her face. She asked me what to do. The whispers answered through me. I told her to listen without asking questions, to accept what was offered without demanding more. The forest responded immediately, showing her a memory, not a vision. Her father standing among the trees, older, calmer, rooted, not suffering, preserved. Sarah reached out and screamed when her hand passed through him like smoke. The forest hummed, disapproving. I felt a warning ripple through my chest. I told her to stop, to listen, but grief is louder than wisdom. The whispers hardened. The trees shifted. The path behind us closed. Sarah begged me to help her bring him back. I felt the weight of the bargain pressing forward. I could offer her certainty at a cost, or I could let the forest decide. I told her the truth at last, that listening meant staying, that memory demanded witnesses, that if she wanted him, she would have to become like him. The forest waited. Sarah looked at the trees, at the darkness between them. Then she looked at me. She asked if I regretted my choice. The whispers fell silent. For the first time since this began, the answer was mine alone. I told her regret was irrelevant. Choice was what mattered. She nodded slowly and stepped forward into the trees. The forest breathed her in gently. The whispers resumed, soft, satisfied. I walked home alone, knowing the town would never see her again. That night, the forest spoke with my voice in my dreams. It thanked me. It said I was learning, and somewhere deep among the roots, another listener began to remember. After Sarah vanished, the forest grew busier. That was the only word that fit. Nights filled with overlapping whispers, layered so densely they formed a constant low murmur beneath my thoughts. I no longer waited for them to begin. They were always there like blood in my ears. The town felt smaller every day, as if the trees were slowly tightening a boundary no one else could see. People started coming to my house without knowing why. They claimed they were lost, even when maps said otherwise. Some said they dreamed of my address written on bark or stone. Others said they followed a feeling. I never turned them away. I no longer asked questions that led nowhere. The whispers coached me through each meeting. What to say, what not to offer, who would leave shaken but intact and who would stay. I told myself I was protecting the the town by guiding the forest appetite, but protection is just control wearing a kinder mask. One man named Thomas arrived shaking with anger instead of fear. He accused the forest of ruining his life. He said his wife had gone missing years ago and that he could still hear her voice at night, calling from the trees. The whispers warned me he would not listen. They said grief had already hollowed him. I tried anyway. I explained the bargain, the cost, the permanence. Thomas laughed bitterly and said he had nothing left to lose. That sentence echoed through me. I had said it once. I watched him walk into the woods before midnight and felt the forest tense like a held breath. By morning he was gone, and the whispers were quiet again. With every listener added, the forest clarity sharpened. I could feel futures collapsing and resolving like muscles flexing. I knew when storms would come, days before clouds formed. I knew which houses would empty and which couples would break. Knowledge settled into me like sediment, heavy and irreversible. The editor called again. His voice trembled as he told me the disappearances were becoming impossible to ignore. Families were demanding answers. Search parties found nothing. He asked if I knew anything. The whispers urged denial, but something else rose instead, a thin thread of pride. I told him some truths without context, that the forest remembered, that not everyone wanted to be found. Silence stretched across the line. Then he asked where to look. The forest shuddered at the question. I told him nowhere. He hung up without another word. That night, the whispers showed me a future where outsiders came armed with machines and fire. They showed me the forest screaming without sound, roots torn from earth, memories scattered. I felt panic for the first time since my brother died. Not for myself, but for the forest. The feeling startled me with its intensity. I realized then how fully the bargain had taken hold. I was no longer serving the forest to survive. I was serving it because I wanted it to endure. I belonged to it now more than to any person. The forest sensed the shift and rewarded it. The whispers became clearer, more precise. They showed me a place beyond the hollow, beyond the door, a core where all paths converged. They said you will stand there soon. They said you will decide how this ends. I tried to remember what I had been before listening. The memory felt distant and unimportant. Faces blurred, voices faded. Even my brother's name felt like a word I once knew in another language. Another knock came near dawn. This time it was a teenage boy, barely 16, eyes wide with terror. He said his friends dared him to enter the forest, and something followed him back. He said it whispered his future every time he closed his eyes. The whispers around me surged, eager. I looked at the boy and felt a flicker of something like mercy. I told him to leave town before nightfall. I told him never to come back. The whispers recoiled sharply, displeased. For the first time I disobeyed. The boy ran. The forest fell silent. Pressure built behind my eyes and pain lanced through my skull. I dropped to my knees, gasping. The whispers returned colder than before. They said you cannot protect what you do not own. They said the forest does not forgive wild memory. I understood the warning. My role was not to choose mercy. It was to ensure continuity. I rose unsteadily, knowing the next choice would cost more. Deep in the woods, a new path opened, glowing faintly like a wound. The whispers called it the convergence. They said every listener must eventually stand there. I am closer now than I have ever been, and the forest is watching how I prepare. The path to the convergence did not appear all at once. It revealed itself in fragments like a memory struggling to surface. One night it was a bend between trees I did not recognize. Another night it was a clearing that vanished when I blinked. The forest was teaching me how to follow without being led. Control was no longer the point. Alignment was. The whispers grew quieter as I moved closer to the core. Not weaker, quieter. They spoke less often, but with greater weight. Each word settled into me like a command I had always known, but only just remembered. The town faded further from relevance. I could not recall the last time I bought groceries or checked the news. None of it mattered compared to the slow, deliberate pull of the trees. I began leaving my house unlocked. People still came, but fewer than before. The forest was becoming selective. It no longer needed many listeners. It needed prepared ones. At night, I stood at the edge of the woods and felt the roots shift beneath the soil, responding to my presence. Somewhere deep inside, something immense was rearranging itself. The editor drove out unannounced late one afternoon. He looked older, thinner eyes ringed with exhaustion. He said he had followed a hunch, not a lead. He asked me to walk with him. Against the whisper's warning, I agreed. We did not go far, only to the tree line. He told me he believed the forest was alive, that it had shaped events for generations, that people like me acted as nodes connecting memory to outcome. He asked if I was afraid. I searched for the feeling and could not find it. I told him fear was inefficient. The forest stirred, displeased. The whispers pressed sharp and cold. They said he sees too clearly. They said clarity leads to disruption. The editor asked what happened to those who stayed too long. I told him the truth, that they became part of what they listened to. His face tightened. He said then, "You are already gone." The words struck harder than any whisper. For a moment, the forest receded, leaving me alone with that thought. I watched the editor step backward, sensing danger without understanding it. I could have let him go. The future branched briefly, showing me a version where he warned others, where the forest burned. I spoke before thinking. I told him to forget what he had learned. The whispers flowed through my voice, shaping tone and cadence. His eyes glazed slightly as understanding drained away. When he left, he would remember only unease. The forest approved. That night, the convergence revealed itself fully. The trees parted into a vast circular basin descending like an inverted dome. Roots arched overhead, forming a cathedral of living wood. At the center stood a massive trunk, unlike any tree I had seen, its bark smooth and dark, pulsing faintly with inner light. The whispers fell silent as I stepped inside. For the first time since this began, there was no guidance, only presence. I approached the central trunk and felt memories press against me, countless lives brushing my mind. I understood then that this was not the heart of the forest. It was its mouth. The surface of the trunk split slowly, opening into a vertical seam. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of soil soil, rain, and blood. Images flooded me without sound. Births, deaths, choices, paths taken and abandoned. The forest was not keeping the future, it was consuming it. I staggered back, horror surging anew. This was not balance. This was hunger refined into purpose. The whispers returned, urgent, fractured. They said, "This is how memory survives." They said, "Without this, nothing endures." I thought of the boy I had let go, of Sarah, of Daniel, rooted and listening forever. I realized the forest did not need my obedience anymore. It needed my consent. The seam began to close. I stepped forward, heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, the future felt uncertain, and uncertainty felt like freedom. I do not know yet what I will choose. Only that the forest is waiting, and so am I. I did not leave the convergence that night. Time behaved differently there, stretching and folding until minutes felt like hours, and hours collapsed into single thoughts. The forest did not rush my decision. It surrounded me with silence, dense and expectant. For the first time since I began listening, I felt truly observed rather than guided. When I finally stepped back, the path behind me was gone, not hidden gone. The basin remained perfectly sealed, roots interwoven like bone. Panic rose, but the whispers returned gently, urging stillness. They said, "You have already chosen to stay long enough." They said the forest does not trap what it trusts. I slept against the central trunk and dreamed without images, only sensations, pressure, warmth, memory moving through me like a tide. When I woke, my sense of time was fractured. I could not tell how long I had been there, but my body felt altered, lighter and heavier at once. The whispers spoke with new clarity. They no longer described futures. They asked questions. What do you remember? What do you fear losing? What would you trade to ensure this place survives? Each question carried weight, shaping something inside me. I realized the forest was testing the limits of my consent. When I left the basin, dawn was breaking over the trees. The town looked unchanged, but wrong, like a photograph misaligned in its frame. Sounds arrived late. Movements lagged. I was slightly ahead of everything now. People noticed. Conversations ended abruptly when I entered rooms. Dogs whined and pulled at leashes when I passed. The forest presence clung to me, visible even to those who could not name it. I had become a threshold. The editor never returned my calls. I learned later he had taken a leave of absence, citing exhaustion and paranoia. The whispers were pleased. They said uncertainty is easier to contain than truth. That afternoon, a group arrived at my door together. 4 adults, 1 child. They claimed they were camping when the forest began speaking to all of them at once. Shared whispers, shared images. They followed the voice to me. I felt the forest stir, eager and cautious. I invited them inside and listened as they spoke over one another, describing the same dream. A great tree opening its mouth, futures spilling like seeds. I knew then the forest was expanding, its reach accelerating towards something final. The whispers urged me to choose only one. The others would forget if guided carefully. I hesitated. Each face reflected a different possible future. The child watched me closely, eyes too aware. I chose the child. The decision felt irreversible the moment it formed. The whispers approved sharply. They said youth adapts best. Memory grows deep roots early. I told the others the forest had rejected them. Their disappointment felt real but fleeting. When they left, their confusion already fading. The child name was Eli. He did not cry. He asked what would happen next. I told him he would listen. He nodded as if expecting nothing else. The forest responded warmly, branches shifting, light filtering down like approval. That night I walked Eli to the tree line. I explained the bargain as gently as possible. He listened without interrupting. When the whispers called his name, he smiled. Something twisted in my chest. I realized this was the first time my choices directly shaped the forest future. Not just preserved it. Power and guilt tangled until I could not tell them apart. Eli stepped forward willingly. The forest accepted him slowly, carefully. I felt a surge of clarity sharper than ever before. Futures aligned rapidly, collapsing into fewer, more stable paths. As I walked home alone, the whispers spoke with reverence. They said, "You are becoming essential." They said the forest will soon ask more of you than guidance. I believe them. I feel something forming beneath the roots, a pressure building toward release. The convergence was not the end. It was a beginning, and I am no longer certain I will be allowed to walk away from what comes next. Eli returned the next night alone. I felt him before I saw him, the way one feels a storm through pressure rather than sound. The forest announced his presence. Subtly, branches leaning, shadows adjusting paths, aligning. He stood at the edge of my porch, hands at his sides, eyes calm and bright, with something that did not belong to a child. He asked if he could come inside. The whispers waited. They did not instruct. That frightened me more than any command. I let him in. Eli spoke differently now, not older but clearer. He described the forest not as a place, but as a process. He said it showed him futures, like overlapping transparencies, teaching him how to focus until one became real. He said listening felt like remembering something he had always known. I felt a sharp mix of pride and dread. The forest had not chosen him at random. It had chosen him efficiently. Over the following days, Eli visited often. He no longer needed directions. He arrived exactly when the whispers predicted. Sometimes he finished my sentences. Sometimes he answered questions I had not yet asked. Each time it happened, the forest stirred, pleased. I began to notice changes in the town that correlated with his presence. Arguments resolved abruptly. Accidents narrowly avoided. People changed their minds at critical moments without knowing why. The forest influence was spreading through him faster than it ever had through me. That realization terrified me. The whispers grew conflicted. They praised Eli adaptability, but warned of imbalance. They said growth must be guided. They said unchecked listeners fracture futures instead of stabilizing them. For the first time, I sensed fear in the forest, not of destruction, but of excess. Eli asked to see the convergence. I refused. The word tasted strange in my mouth, heavy with consequence. Eli did not argue. He only tilted his head, listening inward. When he looked back at me, his eyes held disappointment, not anger. The forest responded immediately. Pressure surged through the ground walls, creaked leaves, rattled without wind. That night I dreamed of roots cracking stone, breaking free, racing outward without restraint. I woke with blood on my pillow, my nose streaming freely. The whispers spoke sharply. They said, "You cannot withhold what you have already given." They said the forest does not raise children, it accelerates them. The next day, Eli went missing. Panic, unlike anything before, tore through me. This was not a predicted absence. This was divergence. I searched the woods, calling his name, feeling the forest resist my movement, subtly redirecting paths. For the first time, the forest was not aligned with me. I found him at dusk, standing before the convergence basin. The trees had opened for him willingly. He smiled when he saw me. He said the forest brought him here, that it wanted him to see what waited beyond memory. The whispers around us were frantic, overlapping, contradictory. They said, "Stop him." They said, "Watch." They said, "Learn." I stepped between Eli and the basin. I told him the forest was not finished with him. He asked how I knew. I realized I no longer did. Eli said the forest had shown him futures, where it outgrew its need for intermediaries, where it spoke directly through many voices at once, where listeners like me became unnecessary. The words hollowed me. He asked if I was afraid of becoming obsolete. Before I could answer, he stepped past me into the basin. The central trunk pulsed brighter than ever before. The seam opened wider than I had seen, releasing a rush of soundless force that knocked me to the ground. Visions tore through me, forests spreading beyond boundaries, cities swallowed quietly, roots threading through foundations, memory replacing history. At the center stood Eli, not consumed but commanding. The whispers screamed in disarray. They had not foreseen this path, or worse, they had and could not stop it. The seam closed abruptly. Silence fell heavy and absolute. When I staggered to my feet, Eli was gone. The forest around me felt stunned, disoriented, like an organism wounded by its own growth. The whispers returned slowly, fragmented, uncertain. They said adaptation carries risk. They said you must help us correct course. As I walked home under a sky too still to be natural, I understood the truth. Eli was no longer just a listener. He was becoming something the forest itself might not be able to control. The forest did not sleep after Eli vanished. Neither did I. The night stretched thin and restless, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The whispers returned in fragments, broken and uncertain, no longer a single will, but many overlapping instincts struggling to agree. I had never heard them argue before. They spoke Eli's name differently now, not as a listener, but as a variable. They said he was moving beyond memory, beyond guidance. They said growth without containment risks collapse. I felt a tremor of something like guilt coil through me. I had delivered him to the forest, and in doing so created something new. something unfinished. At dawn, I walked the perimeter of the woods, mapping subtle changes. New growth pushed through soil where none had existed the day before. Saplings leaned toward paths like eager pupils. The forest was accelerating, reacting to a stimulus it could not fully absorb. People felt it too. The town woke uneasy. Radios hissed with static. Phones dropped calls at the same time across different neighborhoods. Dogs howled in unison just before sunrise, then fell silent. The forest influence was no longer discreet. The editor returned that morning unannounced, eyes wide and unfocused. He said he dreamed of roots threading through his house walls, breathing beneath the floors. He said he woke knowing where Eli had gone, without knowing how he knew. The whispers recoiled at his presence. I told him to leave town immediately. For the first time, I did not soften the warning. He hesitated, then nodded, as if relieved to surrender the decision. As he drove away, the forest shuddered, displeased. I felt pressure spike behind my eyes, a warning. By noon, the convergence basin had changed. The air around it vibrated faintly like heat distortion. The central trunk pulsed erratically, opening and sealing its seam without rhythm. The forest was searching for equilibrium. The whispers asked me a question they had never asked before. Will you intervene? The weight of it staggered me. Intervention meant opposition. It meant choosing limits over expansion. I realized then that my role had evolved again. I was no longer just a conduit or guide. I was a governor. The forest showed me visions of unchecked futures. Eli spreading influence faster than roots could stabilize. Memory overwhelming identity. Humanity dissolving into a single listening organism. Survival without self. I understood what the forest feared. Not destruction, but dilution. I followed the pull deeper than ever before, past the convergence, into places even the whispers treated with caution. The trees here were older, broader, their roots fused into massive ridges like petrified waves. In the center, I found Eli. He did not look like a child anymore. His form shimmered slightly, edges soft, as if reality struggled to agree on him. He smiled when he saw me. He said the forest was afraid because it had never imagined being surpassed. He said memory wanted motion, not preservation. He said futures were meant to flow, not be archived. His voice carried many tones layered together. The whispers begged me to stop him. They promised restoration, balance, even release from listening if I succeeded. The offer tempted me more than I expected. I asked Eli what he wanted. He said he wanted choice to be infinite. He wanted no single path to be favored. He wanted everyone to hear everything. The thought terrified me. I saw what that world would become. No silence, no forgetting, no escape. I stepped toward him, feeling the forest gather behind me, bracing itself. I told Eli that some limits exist for a reason, that forgetting is mercy, that silence makes meaning possible. He listened politely, then shook his head. When he reached out, the forest recoiled violently. Roots snapped, earth buckled. The whispers screamed incoherently. I felt myself tearing between two forces, neither willing to yield. In that moment, I made a choice not shown to me by any future. I pulled Eli into an embrace. The contact burned like ice. Memories surged through me, his and mine and countless others colliding violently. I focused on one thing, the act of letting go, of allowing something to end. The forest surged, sealing around us, constricting, isolating. Eli screamed, not in pain, but in frustration. The light around him dimmed rapidly. When the pressure released, I was alone. The forest fell quiet, stunned into stillness deeper than silence. The whispers returned slowly, reorganizing, humbled. They said balance restored at great cost. They said you have become essential beyond replacement. I walked home under a gray sky, knowing I had crossed a final threshold. The forest still whispers, but now it asks before it speaks. The days after Eli ended felt hollow, like sound after an explosion. The forest remained standing, but something essential had shifted. The whispers were fewer, now more deliberate, each word chosen instead of poured. Silence stretched between them, and in that silence I felt exposed, as if I were finally hearing myself again. The town reacted slowly then, all at once. People reported dreams that faded upon waking, leaving only a sense of loss. Others spoke of memories that felt incomplete, like chapters torn from books. The forest influence was retreating, not disappearing, but pulling inward, conserving itself. Balance had been restored, but at the cost of abundance. I walked the trails daily, cataloging what had changed. Paths once eager now resisted my steps. Trees no longer leaned toward me. I was still recognized but not embraced. The forest had accepted my intervention, but it did not trust me the way it once had. The whispers confirmed it. They said trust follows obedience, not correction. They said you have become a necessary friction. The phrase lingered uncomfortably. At night, I dreamed of Eli, not as he had become, but as he once was a quiet boy standing at the edge of listening. In the dream, he did not accuse me. He simply watched. I woke each time with my chest tight, wondering whether I had saved the world or merely delayed its transformation. The editor sent a single email, no subject line, just a sentence. The woods are quieter. Is that because of you? I did not reply. Some questions cannot be answered without reopening wounds. Weeks passed. Missing person reports declined. The town exhaled. Normality returned in small, convincing ways. Children laughed near the woods again, though not too close. Hikers stayed on marked trails. The forest allowed it. Then the whispers brought news. They said something else had noticed the change. The presence arrived without sound. I sensed it first as absence, a hole where the forest attention should have been. Birds fled. Insects fell silent. The trees stiffened as if bracing. The whispers retreated to a tight, controlled murmur. I followed the disturbance to the far eastern edge where the forest thinned into marshland. There, the ground sank into dark water, and dead trees rose like broken teeth. Something moved beneath the surface, displacing water in slow, deliberate waves. The whispers spoke with urgency. They said this is what comes when memory weakens. They said this is not of us. The water parted, and something emerged, tall and pale, its surface smooth like exposed root, stripped of bark. It did not have eyes yet. It faced me. I felt pressure against my thoughts, searching, testing boundaries. It spoke without sound, not in words, but in subtraction. Memories blurred at the edges, threatening to dissolve. I staggered, holding on to my sense of self. The whispers rallied around me, forming a barrier. They said, "Remember who you are." They said, "Hold shape." I realized then that my role had changed again. I was no longer just balancing the forest. I was defending it. The entity recoiled slightly, assessing resistance. It withdrew back into the marsh, leaving ripples that took too long to settle. The forest remained rigid long after it was gone. The whispers explained. They said when one system limits itself, others expand to fill the gap. They said forgetting invites consumption. They said the forest had enemies older than humanity. Fear returned sharp and clear. I had assumed my choice ended a crisis. Instead, it had announced weakness. That night, the forest spoke plainly. They said, "We need you more than before. Not as listener, not as governor, but as sentinel." They said, "You must learn to distinguish our voice from those that imitate absence." I accepted without ceremony. Some choices no longer required deliberation. As dawn broke, I stood at the tree line, watching fog lift from the marsh. The world felt fragile in a new way, not doomed but exposed. I understood now that silence was not the opposite of horror. It was the space where something else could enter, and I was the only one who knew how to listen for it. Becoming a boundary changed how I perceived sound. I learned that danger did not always announce itself with noise. Often it arrived as an absence, a subtraction so complete it left the world feeling hollow. The forest taught me to listen for what failed to echo. That skill saved me more than once. The marsh remained quiet for several days after the pale presence withdrew. Too quiet. Water lay flat without wind. Birds avoided the reeds entirely. Even insects refused to cross the boundary line I marked with my steps each dawn. The forest did not press forward. It waited. The whispers adapted to my new role. They spoke only when necessary, offering frameworks rather than commands. They said you must learn the patterns of intrusion. They said what comes from outside does not remember itself the way we do. That difference is your advantage. I began patrolling at night when absence was easier to feel. I carried no light. My eyes adjusted, and the forest responded subtly, opening safe paths and closing others. We were no longer merged, but aligned by purpose. On the fifth night, I sensed a ripple from the marsh that did not match the earlier intrusion. This one moved cautiously, skirting the edge, probing. It learned. That frightened me more than raw force. Intelligence without memory was unpredictable. The whispers warned restraint. They said, "Do not confront what has not crossed." I held positioned, feeling pressure build against my thoughts like a tide testing a barrier. For hours, nothing happened. Then a shape formed at the boundary where roots met water. It resembled a man, only loosely, its outline stitched together from shadow and reflection. Where a face should have been, there was only smoothness. It mimicked posture, hesitation, curiosity. I understood then that it was studying me. I did not speak. Silence was my weapon. The forest gathered behind me, lending density to the boundary. The shape reached forward, and the air distorted as if stretched thin. Memories tugged at the edges of my awareness. Names, places, emotions threatened to slip away. I anchored myself by recalling my brother's face, the way grief felt sharp and personal. The shape recoiled, slightly unsettled by resistance rooted in specificity. The whispers confirmed it. They said individuality repels it. It feeds on generalized memory, not lived detail. The shape withdrew but did not leave. It lingered, observing. I realized then this was not an attack. It was reconnaissance. By morning, the marsh showed signs of alteration. Reeds bent inward, forming crude paths. Water pooled into unnatural stillness. Something was preparing a passage. The forest responded by tightening its interior roots, diverting animals, sealing older trails. I felt its strain. Maintaining boundaries required energy, and the forest had already limited itself. I knew this standoff could not last. That afternoon, the editor returned again, defying my warning. He looked shaken but determined. He said others were reporting similar disturbances near wetlands miles away. He said something was spreading. I felt the forest bristle. I told him to leave immediately, but he refused. He said he needed to document what was happening, to warn people. The whispers urged caution. Exposure could draw attention we could not repel. I compromised. I told him enough to frighten him, but not enough to clarify. I described absence. I described forgetting. I described a thing that learns by watching. His resolve wavered. That night, the marsh intruder crossed the boundary. It did not force its way through. It copied me. It mirrored my stance, my patience, my stillness. The forest reacted too late, realizing imitation was the gap. The boundary bent and the shape slipped inside. Pain exploded through my skull as memories tore free. I screamed, and the forest surged to contain the breach. Roots erupted water, drained violently, and the shape fractured momentarily. I lunged forward, grasping what felt like cold smoke. I pressed my will into detail, my life, my failures, my guilt, my love. The shape convulsed, unable to hold coherence under the weight of specificity. It fled deeper into the forest, dissolving as it went. The whispers roared approval and fear in equal measure. They said this will happen again. They said others will come better prepared. As dawn broke, the forest settled, exhausted but intact. I collapsed against a tree, shaking. I had held the boundary once, but at a cost. I could feel parts of myself thinned, scraped raw. The whispers spoke softly. They said you cannot stand alone forever. They said boundaries require succession. I knew what that meant. Somewhere beyond the trees, another listener would be needed, not to hear the forest, but to remember humanity. And I would have to choose again. After the breach, the forest began to prepare in ways I could feel but not fully see. Paths rearranged themselves overnight. Roots thickened beneath the soil like muscles tensing before exertion. The whispers shifted from reaction to planning, and in that change, I sensed urgency threaded with restraint. The forest had learned something from the intruder. So had I. I no longer patrolled alone. Animals moved with purpose, now guiding me away from weakened ground toward places of strength. Even the wind seemed to cooperate, falling silent when listening mattered most. I understood that the forest was conserving resources, choosing when to speak and when to wait. Silence had become strategy. The entity returned on the third night, not to attack, but to observe again. It stayed just beyond the boundary where the trees thinned into marsh and shadow. This time it wore familiarity. Its outline borrowed gestures from people I knew, my editor, my brother, even myself. Each shape flickered briefly, then dissolved into the next. The whispers warned me not to engage. They said imitation seeks invitation. I held my ground, focusing on the weight of my body against the earth. The entity mirrored the stance perfectly. The boundary strain. I realized then that it was not copying me randomly. It was learning the shape of authority. It wanted my role. That knowledge chilled me more deeply than any threat of death. If it crossed fully, it would not just consume memory. It would replace stewardship with erasure. The forest responded by revealing a truth it had withheld. They showed me fragments of earlier boundaries, watchers who stood before me across centuries. None had remained forever. Each had trained another, then faded quietly, becoming part of the remembered soil. Succession was not failure. It was survival. I resisted the implication, but the whispers pressed gently. They said, "You are thinning." They said holding the line costs more each time. They were right. I felt exhaustion settle into my bones and memories fray at the edges. Pieces of my life had already been traded away. The editor returned once more, driven by obsession rather than curiosity. He had seen the shape near the marsh. He had felt something watching through absence. He demanded the truth. The forest recoiled, but did not silence him. I told him everything. I spoke of the forest memory of Eli, of the intruder, of boundaries and succession. He listened without interruption, his face pale but resolute. When I finished, he asked the question I had been avoiding. "Who comes after you?" The answer formed before fear could stop it. "You!" The whispers surged, conflicted but not opposed. The forest examined him, measuring resilience, curiosity, attachment. He felt it and did not flee. That mattered. Training began immediately, subtle at first. I taught him how to listen without hearing, how to anchor identity in detail, how to recognize imitation through absence. He struggled often, but learned quickly. Too quickly. The entity sensed the shift and reacted violently. On the seventh night, it pressed against the boundary with force rather than mimicry. The marsh boiled roots snapped, and the forest screamed through the whispers. We stood together holding the line. The editor faltered once, and the entity slipped a fragment through a memory shard, sharp and cold. He screamed but held on. I sealed the breach at terrible cost. When the night ended, the forest was wounded but intact. The entity withdrew, furious and patient. The whispers spoke with final clarity. They said the transition has begun. They said you must choose the moment. I looked at the editor, exhausted, shaking but alive. I saw in him the same path that once opened before me, terror and purpose intertwined. I knew then that my story was moving toward its end, not in death, but in diffusion. The forest does not keep individuals forever. It keeps roles, and mine was already being prepared for release. The forest marked the beginning of the end without ceremony. One morning I woke unable to recall the sound of my own name spoken aloud. It was not erased, just distant, like a word from a language I no longer used. The whispers told me this was expected. They said identity loosens before transfer. Nothing is taken all at once. Training the editor became less about instruction and more about endurance. He learned how to stand still for hours without drifting, how to anchor himself to small, precise memories, the weight of a pen, the smell of old paper, the sound of a car door closing at night. These details mattered. They were ballast against the pull of absence. The forest tested him relentlessly. Paths looped unexpectedly. Voices mimicked his thoughts. Dreams bled into waking moments. Each time he resisted, the forest adjusted, measuring resilience and adaptability. I watched with a mixture of pride and dread, knowing this was how it once tested me. The entity did not wait patiently anymore. It pressed against the boundary every night now, probing for weakness. Its form stabilized, taking on clearer outlines, a torso, limbs, a suggestion of a face that never resolved. It had learned efficiency. The whispers warned us the next breach would be decisive. They said the boundary could not hold indefinitely with two sentinels, one fading and one unformed. A choice would be forced. I began forgetting things out of sequence. The color of my childhood bedroom, the route to my first job. Even my brother face blurred when I tried to hold it too tightly. Letting go hurt less than resisting. I understood now why succession was necessary. No one could carry this weight forever. On the sixth night, the forest signaled convergence. Not the basin this time, but the boundary itself. The marsh churned violently, and the trees leaned inward, forming a narrow corridor. The entity waited at the far end, patient and confident. The whispers spoke with rare unanimity. They said one of you must stand fully within the boundary, and one must stand outside. They said only one will remain after tonight. The editor looked at me, eyes steady despite fear. He said he was ready. The simplicity of the statement nearly broke me. I stepped forward, intending to take the outside position to draw the entity away. The forest resisted gently but firmly. The whispers said, "You have already begun to dissolve. You cannot anchor the line." Understanding settled with terrible calm. This was not about sacrifice. It was about function. We took our positions. The editor stood within the forest roots, rising around his feet, responding eagerly. I stood closer to the marsh, where the air felt thin and cold. The entity advanced, testing both of us. It reached toward the editor and recoiled, unable to grasp his anchored specificity. It turned to me and surged forward, feeding on my thinning edges. Pain flared as memories tore free. I held long enough. The editor stepped forward as the forest claimed him fully. Roots wrapped his legs, his spine, his chest, but did not crush. They integrated, his face contorted. then smoothed into focus sharper than I had ever seen it. He spoke once with his own voice, thanking me. Then the forest spoke through him. The entity screamed soundlessly as the boundary solidified. It was forced back into the marsh, its form unraveling under the weight of preserved memory. The water swallowed it with violent finality. When silence returned, the corridor collapsed. The forest stood whole again. I fell to my knees, barely aware of the ground. The whispers faded from my hearing, retreating into the editor. Now, something else, something more. As dawn broke, I realized I could no longer hear the forest clearly. Its voice had moved on. I was still alive, but lighter, emptied of purpose. Succession was complete, and I had become what waits after listening ends. When the forest voice left me, the world rushed back too quickly. Sound returned without warning, harsh and layered. Wind scraped branches. Insects buzzed without rhythm. My own breathing sounded intrusive, as if it did not belong to the landscape anymore. I realized then how much the whispers had softened reality by filtering it. I stayed on my knees long after dawn fully broke. The forest no longer acknowledged my presence. Paths remained closed. Roots lay still. Whatever connection had once existed was severed cleanly. Succession had not wounded the forest. It had excised me. Walking back toward town felt like trespassing. Every step carried weight without direction. I expected grief, but what came instead was disorientation. Without futures pressing against my thoughts, the present felt unbearably wide. Choice returned suddenly, and I did not know how to hold it. People noticed me again in ordinary ways. A neighbor waved. A clerk asked how my day was going. These small interactions struck harder than any horror. I could not hear what would happen next. I could not feel which words mattered. I was blind in time. At night, I dreamed of Eli and the editor both standing deep in the forest, neither speaking. When I woke, there were no whispers to interpret the silence. Only memory remained unreliable and soft. I tried returning to my old routines. Writing failed first. Words refused to align without the pressure of inevitability. Each sentence felt optional and therefore meaningless. Journalism had once relied on certainty, even if it was false. Now uncertainty ruled. The forest did not stay distant for long. On the fourth night after succession, I felt something familiar brush the edge of perception. Not the whispers, but their echo. A residue. I followed it instinctively to the tree line, stopping short of entry. The forest did not open for me. It did not close either. It simply ignored me. Then I heard it. Not guidance, not prophecy. A question. Do you miss us? The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, thin and testing. It was not the forest. It lacked depth. It tasted of absence. Froze, realizing too late what lingered. The defeated entity had not been destroyed. It had been dispersed. Fragments of it clung to places where memory thinned, to people like me, newly emptied. I understood then why succession demanded removal rather than coexistence. Vacuums attract. The voice returned softer. It offered restoration. It said listening could return without cost. It said I could hear futures again if I stepped closer. I backed walked away shaking. For the first time since this began, fear was uncomplicated and sharp. I ran home, locking the door as if that could stop something that did not need entry. Sleep did not come. Memories fluttered loose, unanchored by purpose. Near dawn, I felt pressure build again, but this time it came from inside. The fragment was learning my shape. I made a decision without foresight or permission. I burned the notebook. The pages that once recorded whispers caught quickly, the ink flaring unnaturally bright before collapsing into ash. As the fire consumed them, the presence recoiled violently. The air snapped cold. Something screamed without sound and vanished. When morning arrived, the echo was gone. I sat in the quiet, exhausted and terrified. The forest had not intervened. It had trusted the succession to hold. I understood then that my role was not finished. It had simply changed again. I was no longer a listener or a sentinel. I was a scar, a place where something once passed and could not again. And scars ache when storms are coming. Living without the whispers felt like learning to breathe after years underwater. Every decision arrived naked without warning or reassurance. I woke each morning uncertain of the day ahead, and that uncertainty was heavier than fear had ever been. The forest remained silent. It did not watch me. It did not care. That absence was deliberate. The town resumed its routines, unaware of how close it had come to becoming something else. People argued about trivial things, complained about weather, and prices laughed in cafes. I studied their faces, searching for signs of thinning memory or borrowed silence. Most were untouched, but not all. It began with small inconsistencies. A woman at the grocery store forgot her own address. A man insisted he had a brother who no one else remembered. Children described imaginary friends who spoke only when adults were not listening. These were not forest whispers. They lacked cohesion. They drifted. I recognized the pattern too late. The fragments had not died. They had learned a new strategy. Instead of approaching the forest boundary, they settled into people already hollowed by routine grief or loneliness. They fed quietly. One evening I heard my name spoken again, not from the woods, from inside my house. I froze, heart pounding as the voice repeated it gently from the hallway. It sounded like me, but younger, uncertain. I did not answer. Silence stretched, then footsteps retreated. When I checked the rooms, nothing was there, but something had tested me. I stopped sleeping. At night, I walked the streets, watching windows darken and lights flicker. I listened not for prophecy, but for distortion. The fragments left residue, cold spots in sound, gaps in memory. I followed those disturbances like a hunter tracking breath. I found my first host at the old library. A man sat alone at a table surrounded by books he was not reading. His eyes were unfocused. His lips moved soundlessly. When I approached, he smiled with too much relief. He said it told him stories about what might have been, futures where his wife lived, where his son forgave him. The fragment offered comfort, not command. That was its brilliance. I told him the truth as gently as I could, that the voice was not returning what he lost. It was hollowing him to make space for itself. He did not believe me. When I reached out to ground him, he screamed and fled, leaving the library lights flickering wildly. The fragments adapted faster than I expected. They stopped speaking directly. They began showing images through dreams, reflections, shadows. People woke with emotions that did not belong to them: grief, nostalgia, hope, untethered from cause. The town grew unstable in ways no one could articulate. I realized then that without the forest balance, nothing filtered these intrusions. Memory had become porous. I returned to the forest edge, seeking help, knowing none would come. The trees remained closed. Succession meant finality. The forest would not intervene again unless the boundary itself was threatened. So I adapted. I began recording everything: names, times, phrases, patterns. I rebuilt a map of intrusion using human detail instead of prophecy. I used specificity as a weapon. Each time I confronted a fragment with facts, it recoiled, unable to sustain itself under weight of reality. But the cost was constant vigilance. I could not rest. I could not forget. The irony was sharp. I had escaped the whispers only to become their opposite. One night I realized the fragments were converging, not toward the forest, but toward me. I was the common reference point, the scar they could not cross but could circle endlessly. I understood the risk. If they overwhelmed me, there would be nothing left to stop them. I prepared the only defense I had left. I wrote my story, every detail I could remember, every choice, every loss, every fear. I anchored myself in narrative so dense nothing could displace it. If they came, they would have to pass through all of me. The house grew cold as I finished the last page. I felt them gather, pressing against walls and windows like breath on glass. I did not know if this would work, but I knew the forest was listening, even if it no longer spoke. The night the fragments came together, the air felt brittle, as if sound itself might crack. I finished the last sentence of my story and set the pen down carefully. My hands shook, not from fear but from exhaustion. Writing had anchored me for weeks, holding the pieces of my identity in place like nails through wood. Now the house felt too quiet to be empty. The first knock did not come from the door. It came from the walls, a soft, polite tapping that moved from room to room, testing structure and patience. I stood still, listening for rhythm, for intent. The fragments were learning to coordinate. That was new. I spoke aloud to hear my own voice. I said my name. I said where I was born. I said the date. Each word felt like a weight dropped into deep water. The tapping paused, then resumed closer. Lights flickered, shadows stretched beyond their sources. The fragments began to speak not in sentences, but in echoes, repeating my words slightly altered. They tried to smooth the edges to generalize me. I countered with detail: the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the exact color of my brother jacket the last time I saw him. The fragments recoiled, hissing without sound. The door handle turned slowly. I had not locked it. I realized then that barriers mattered less than certainty. The door opened, and 3 figures stepped inside, each wearing a different version of familiarity. One had my face younger, unlined. One wore my editor posture and glasses. The third wore nothing recognizable, only a suggestion of a person filled with moving absence. They spoke together, offering relief. They said the forest no longer needed me. They said I could rest if I let go of the story. They promised silence. The offer tempted me more than any threat. Silence had become precious. I felt my resolve slip, and with it, the edges of the room softened. The figures moved closer, synchronizing their steps. I did the only thing left. I read the story aloud. Every page, every mistake, every shame, every doubt. I did not perform. I documented. The words filled the house, heavy and specific. The fragments staggered as if struck by gravity, their borrowed shapes, destabilized faces melting into uncertainty. They tried to interrupt, speaking over me, rewriting lines, offering improvements. I raised my voice, anchoring each sentence with sensory detail. The chair leg wobble, the crack in the ceiling, the exact hour the editor thanked me. Reality thickened. The figure with my face screamed silently and collapsed inward, folding into nothing. The editor-shaped fragment lunged, then dissolved as the words pinned it in place. The last presence resisted hardest, stretching shadows toward me, tearing pages from the manuscript. I continued reading even as paper ripped from my hands. I spoke from memory, refusing to stop. The house groaned as if under strain. The fragments shrank, compressing into a single knot of absence, pulsing angrily. At the climax of the story, when succession completed and the forest voice left me, the knot convulsed violently. It had no foothold in that moment. It shattered, dispersing like ash in a vacuum. Silence followed, immediate and complete. I sank to the floor, throat raw, vision blurred. Dawn light seeped through the windows, revealing an ordinary room, scarred by nothing more than scattered pages. The fragments were gone, not defeated permanently, but scattered thin enough to be harmless for now. I gathered the remaining pages, hands steady at last. The story was incomplete. Pages were missing, sentences ended abruptly. That was acceptable. Totality had never been the goal. Integrity was. At the forest edge, I felt a presence, not a whisper, not guidance, but acknowledgement. The forest had not intervened yet. It had not turned away. Balance held. I understood then the final rule. Stories are boundaries. They do not predict the future. They prevent erasure. As long as this story is told, the fragments will hesitate. And as long as someone listens, the forest will remember. Even without speaking, the morning after the house fell quiet, I walked into town carrying the remaining pages under my arm. People greeted me with the familiar politeness reserved for neighbors whose lives you do not question. I wondered how many of them felt the subtle shift the night before. How many sensed that something had recoiled just beyond awareness. The fragments had not vanished entirely. I could feel their residue like static after lightning. They lingered in places where memory thinned, waiting for neglect, but they no longer moved freely. The story had narrowed their paths. I understood then that containment was not a single act. It was maintenance. I began sharing the story carefully, not as confession or warning, but as narrative. I told it at the library first, where silence already held weight. People listened with the polite distance reserved for fiction. That distance protected them, Belief was not required. Attention was. As I spoke, I watched for signs of disturbance, flickering lights, uneasy glances, sudden gaps in focus. When those appeared, I leaned into detail, grounding the story in specificity. The fragments recoiled each time, unable to survive precision delivered publicly. Words spread slowly, not of danger, but of a story worth hearing. I was invited to small gatherings, living rooms, community centers, late-night radio programs. I never described the forest directly. I described choices. I described loss. I described how silence can lie. The forest remained distant but present. At times I felt a low acknowledgement when a telling held the line particularly well. It did not guide me. It did not correct me. That autonomy felt like trust earned too late. The editor never returned. I heard he moved away, started a new life under a different byline. That was as it should be. Some guardians are not meant to be remembered. The fragments adapted again, but more slowly now. They tried to hide inside collective experiences, trends, viral stories, generalized fears. I countered by narrowing focus, telling one life at a time. Names mattered. Details mattered. Anonymity was their shelter. One night after a long reading, I walked home through a light rain. The streetlights hummed steadily. A man stepped from an alley and asked if I believed the stories myself. His eyes searched my face hungrily. I told him belief was irrelevant. I told him listening changed things whether you agreed or not. He nodded too quickly and smiled. I did not invite him closer. At home, I added a final page to the manuscript. Not an ending, but an instruction. I wrote about how stories function as fences, not walls. They do not trap, they define space. Placed copies of the story in locations where silence pooled: hospitals, shelters, transit stations, places where people waited. The fragments avoided those places instinctively. Exhaustion settled into my bones, but it was a familiar, honest fatigue. I slept deeply for the first time in months. In dreams, I did not see the forest. I saw rooms filled with people listening quietly, holding details like talismans. I saw fragments hesitate at thresholds, uncertain and diminished. I woke knowing the work was nearly done. The final step was release. I walked to the forest edge at dusk, carrying nothing with me. The trees did not move. I did not expect them to. I spoke aloud, not to the forest, but to the space between us. I thanked it for memory and restraint. I apologized for interference. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a breeze passed through the leaves, carrying a sound, not quite a whisper, not quite silence. A farewell. I turned away. The forest did not follow. That night I mailed the last copies of the story to people I had never met. Archivists, librarians, broadcasters. Once released, the story no longer belonged to me. Neither did the burden. What remains is vigilance, not fear. The fragments will return in other forms, but now there is a method to hold them, and it does not require knowing the future. I am writing this, knowing it will outlive my voice. That is the final discipline the forest taught me, even after it stopped speaking. Stories do not need guardians forever. They need circulation. Once they move freely, they become resilient to erasure. Years have passed since the night the fragments shattered in my house. The town looks unchanged to visitors. The forest stands as it always has, tall and quiet and indifferent to photographs. People hike its edges and tell ghost stories that never quite reach the truth. That distance is intentional. Precision protects better than belief. I no longer patrol boundaries. I do not hunt distortions. I listen in the ordinary way, now through conversations, pauses, laughter, grief. When something feels thin, I tell a story. Not always this one, just a true one full of texture and detail. The effect is subtle but consistent. The world steadies. The forest does not whisper anymore, but it remembers. I feel that occasionally as a pressure behind the sternum when someone listens closely enough to carry something forward. Memory transfers silently from person to person without instruction. I have learned to recognize the fragments when they try to return. They appear in trends that promise certainty, in voices that smooth complexity into comfort. They fear specificity and flee from names, dates, tactile truth. They cannot survive where attention is honest. I keep no originals now. Every copy of the story is slightly different, shaped by the teller voice and context. That variation is protection. Uniform stories fracture easily. Living ones adapt. Sometimes someone asks if the forest ever spoke to me. I say it did, and it taught me to stop waiting for answers. That response usually ends the conversation. Curiosity satisfied without invitation. At night I still dream, but not of futures. I dream of rooms where people lean forward listening to one another. I dream of children learning to describe the world carefully so nothing important slips away in those dreams. The forest is present only as shelter, not authority. On my last visit to the tree line, I stood where the path once opened for me. It did not respond. That was right. Roles end when they should. As I turned to leave, a breeze passed through the leaves, carrying a sound like a book closing. Not farewell, not warning. Completion. If you are hearing this now, then the story has reached you intact enough to matter. You do not need to believe it. You only need to listen. When you leave here, notice the details around you, the way light settles on surfaces, the specific weight of a moment. That attention builds quiet fences the fragments cannot cross. The forest does not need you. The future does not belong to anyone, but memory survives through care. And that is how this ends. By continuing, the story ends here. Thank you for watching and listening to the whole story. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell to listen to the next stories.